If you have a scary story you'd like to have narrated, please consider sending it my way. Just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. As a child, the holidays were always filled with family, love, and fun. We all gathered at my Aunt Lisa and Uncle Scott's house, and some of us were there early the day of Thanksgiving, and the last ones to leave. We had some folks that would trickle in here and there just to stop by for a bit before they had to go to another family member's home. We typically showed up around noon, as my mom would make a few side dishes at home, and then I would be tasked with making sure the box of containers didn't spill in the back seat. I loved going over there because she was my favorite aunt. My Aunt Lisa was my dad's sister, and she was very eccentric, is the best way to put it. As more family showed up, I was excited when I saw my Uncle Todd arrive. He was my dad's youngest brother, and while I loved all of my other family members, he was a top-tier uncle. He was always known for his playful antics, cheesy jokes, and the way that he could effortlessly become the life of the party. But the Thanksgiving of 2001 would, unfortunately, change how I felt about Uncle Todd. Everyone started showing up and testing out the side dishes while my grandma and Aunt Lisa would shoo everyone away. There were a few of us kids playing in the yard, keeping ourselves entertained. Even when it came time for dinner, it went as well as any other family dinner. Later that night, those of us who were still there were relaxing and trying not to pass out from food comas. A lot of my cousins had already left, but one of my older cousins was in their room. She was Aunt Lisa and Uncle Scott's daughter. A few of my younger cousins were either playing together or were asleep on the couch. So, I'd been sitting on the floor watching TV. While I was sitting there, my Uncle Todd came into the room and asked me what I was watching. I excitedly told him about the show, and, as kids often do, I had to explain the whole plot of the story and the characters. I watched him as I talked and could see his demeanor was different than what I was used to. He seemed somber, and his smile kind of felt forced. I asked him if he was okay, not knowing what else to do, and he smiled at me and said, "Yeah, of course, buddy. Hey, why don't you come with me? We need to run to the store real quick. Your mom asked me to pick up something." Again, I loved my Uncle Todd, and I thought going for a quick ride with him would be fun. I still had my shoes on, but it had been cold outside, so I walked towards the corridor to get my jacket, but my uncle stopped me saying that I wasn't going to need it. He assured me that I could stay in the car in the heat when he got out. I thought that made sense, so when he motioned to go out the back door, located in the living room that I was in, I happily skipped out the door with him. The car ride started off normal enough. Uncle Todd asked me about school and my friends as we drove through the neighborhood. But as we turned onto the ramp to the highway, his tone and question trailed off, and I became curious as to where we were going. We didn't live far from my aunt and uncle's place, so I knew of at least one store that was close enough that we didn't need to take the highway. It was silent for probably a few seconds, but it became pretty awkward. I kept looking over at him and noticed how hard he was gripping the steering wheel while staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, Uncle Todd let out a wail and started to cry, causing me to jump. "You're lucky, you know," he said between his sobs. "You've got so much time ahead of you, so much time to decide what to do with your life, so much time to fix all your mistakes." His words confused me, especially as they were met with tears. I could feel the car was speeding up, going down the nearly empty highway, and I started to become terrified as well. As I felt the car shake from the speed, my uncle talked about missed opportunities, all of his unfulfilled dreams, and feeling trapped in a life that he never wanted. I could feel this huge sense of sadness looming over my uncle, and while I was now in tears from being terrified, I also found myself crying with him. And suddenly, Uncle Todd began yelling. I could just keep going, you know? I could drive off an embankment, no one could stop me. No one would have to feel sorry for me, and you would never have to experience this crushing reality of this hell that we call life. I didn't understand any of this, and I was terrified. Uncle Todd was always so full of life and happiness. I only ever saw people show him love, including myself. Why did he seem so sad now? Why was he saying all of these things? I was young enough to not understand what was happening, but old enough to know that if something didn't change, we could both die. I choked back tears and finally found my voice enough to say, I love you, Uncle Todd, no matter what. He kept looking over at me, taking these deep breaths, and after a heavy sigh, I felt the speed of the car start to decrease. He continued to sob, but it slowed down little by little, along with the car. He got off the highway and took the back roads in silence. He sniffled a few times, but that was all the sound that was being made inside the car. As we pulled back into the house, he looked at me, patted me on the shoulder, and said that he was sorry. He motioned for me to go ahead and get out, and I slowly hopped out, waiting for him to follow. But he stayed sitting in the driver's seat with the car off. Shortly after I got out, the scene became pretty chaotic. My mom came running outside. Her face was red and streaked with tears. She instantly grabbed me in a hug, telling me that I was okay, that I was safe. Everyone else was now outside, and several of my family members were shouting at Uncle Todd angrily. I was scared and relieved to be home, but all I could think about was my uncle. I shouted back at them to leave him alone, and they all looked back and forth between me and my uncle. Before I could really comprehend everything, the red and blue lights showed up, and my uncle was forcibly pulled out of the car. I became even more scared for my uncle, as no one would listen to me, nor ask me what happened, and I felt like he was being looked at as a bad guy. But even though I was scared and I knew what he said, I couldn't bring myself to be mad at him like everyone else seemed to be. I didn't see Uncle Todd for a long time after that, even though I asked about him pretty frequently. We had a party at our house, and I was ecstatic to finally see him there, and while he seemed like the happy and cheerful uncle that I knew him as, this time it was different. It felt real. He was warm and lighthearted. He was soft-spoken and just all around had that aura to him that anyone would want to be around. I was happy to have him back. It wasn't until many years later that I fully understood the depth of what had happened that day. As it may seem obvious to those of you reading this now, Uncle Todd had been battling some unseen demons and an overwhelming sense of despair that he thought he could escape from that night. One that could have ended tragically for both of us, and changed our family's lives forever. Thankfully, he realized that night that he needed help. And, slowly, over the years, he found his way back to being who he wanted to be. The real Todd. And I will always be thankful for that. I don't know if it was something else that he saw, or thought about, or if it was just my words that made him turn around that night, but it's something that I will never forget. I grew up in a very loving, yet unique household, at least in my opinion. I was adopted, but many people would say that it was a weird time for my parents to do so. They're pretty well set in life. My father owns an accounting firm that was passed down to him by my grandfather, and my mom became part of that family and embraced it well. They adopted me when I was 3, And I know people have made many comments about it to them, and to me, because they adopted me when they were in their 50s. This was not a situation of a kid or a family member having a child that they couldn't take care of either. They went through all the legal motions to adopt a kid, and even mentioned how they had some difficulties due to their age. But eventually, they won, and I'm forever grateful for that. But I also wasn't the only child. They have a son, a biological son, named Danny, and there was a 15-year difference between us. When they were going through the motions of adoption, my brother, their son, had just graduated from high school. He was still living at home and wasn't attending college as he was still trying to decide what he wanted to do. So while I did get to know him as I grew up, we weren't close enough to really play together or bond. It was like he was another adult or family member, but nonetheless, I still treated him like my brother and called him as such, because he was all I had. However, he did not seem to feel the same about me. While he didn't outwardly express it to me, he made it obvious to my parents, and I eventually heard about it as I got older. Unfortunately, that's how this story came to be. My parents truly did treat us equally. They supported us both, celebrated our accomplishments, grieved with us when we were upset, and even both got in trouble for the bad things, even though he was a young adult. He was still living under their roof, after all. However, I could always feel a sense of anger or jealousy from Danny. He never wanted to attend any of my school functions or plays, or any of my baseball games, which was pretty disheartening. My parents did their best to not make me feel so bad about it, and it typically worked. So, as I got older, with a good support system including my parents and family, who all loved and accepted me, thankfully, as well as my friends, I excelled in just about everything I did. I did great in school, and I already had ideas of what I wanted to do after I finished high school. And no, my intentions were not to work under my father in his accounting firm. I wanted to major in graphic design and business management, hoping to run my own business. That, of course, was inspired by my parents, as I wanted to be my own boss. I took all the extra classes that would help me get there, and I loved it. So, fast forward here, I was in my senior year of high school and, of course, was still living at home, and my brother Danny, now 32, had a place of his own. I was on our holiday break and was helping my parents prepare for Thanksgiving dinner. I helped my mom bake the pies the night prior and even helped my dad stock up on firewood so we could have the fireplace prepared. Our Thanksgiving was typically pretty small. It was usually just the four of us. Sometimes Danny would bring a girl with him that he was seeing at the time, and some of our neighbors would stop by, and my mom would exchange sweets with them. I loved our neighbor's pumpkin roll. The next Friday, the three of us would go over to my aunt's to have a bigger dinner with them and my grandparents when they were around. So this year was no different. It started with three of us, and Danny showed up later, but this time, he was later than usual. My mom had become a bit upset with him as he hadn't even bothered to call and tell her, and these holidays were always very important to her. I mean, he's known her longer than me, so he should understand that, but he still didn't seem to care. When he finally arrived, my mom gave him one of her stern talkings, but then we all carried on. I tried talking to him on a few occasions and asked how he was doing, and he always just gave me these short answers and never offered the same. So, I never talked about myself to him. I had also noticed that he seemed to be on edge that evening. He would give short answers to my parents, and just seemed to be close to going off on someone the entire time. We finally got to dinner, and the dining room was set up to where you could see the TV in the living room from the table. My parents often left it on, especially on Thanksgiving, as my dad liked to watch the game. Surprisingly, Danny and I had that in common. Neither one of us liked football. But I was thankful that it was on because, otherwise, it would have been too quiet that day. They both still paid attention to the conversation, though, and thankfully my dad wasn't the type to shout at the TV from the table. The conversation started fine. My mom asked how Danny was doing and what he was up to. He learned that he'd had quite a thing for antique cars recently, and he was talking about opening his own car shop that specialized in antique cars. And my parents were supportive of that too. At the time, he was just working at a different shop and was going to some kind of school to learn about it, like a community college, I think it was. My mom asked how it was going, and I just remember him constantly complaining about it. He said that he hated the owners that he worked under, and the guys that he worked with were all jerks. He said that he didn't like his professor as he felt like he was targeting him, and how some of the assignments seemed irrelevant. Yet, my mom was always the optimistic type, and she tried her best to find some positive things about it. My dad even said that he was proud of him for still sticking with it, and that after he finished school, if he was still serious about it, he would go in on a loan to get him the property that he needed. When I heard this, I thought it was really cool, as it also seemed to loosen him up a bit too. I then joked, saying that I could help him set up his website and create a banner for him due to my work in exchange for a family discount on car repairs, because I did have an old used car at the time. He snapped at me, saying that he didn't need my help. My mom immediately told him to be nice because I was just trying to be helpful, but the damage was already done. I was upset, but I did my best to stay upbeat for the sake of my parents. However, it only seemed to get worse when my parents asked about my plans after school. I was keeping it a surprise for Christmas, but I thought maybe to lighten the mood I would go ahead and share it early. I told them how I had found a college that I wanted to go to, as it had a great graphic and web design program, and I had already completed the pre-enrollment process. There was a test that you had to take for acceptance, and I'd passed it all. I just had to complete the last part of the enrollment, and I was set. They also had apartments that you could include in your tuition that were in the area. They weren't quite dorms, as they were bigger, and based on the pictures, they were actual apartments. So I was pretty excited to have my own place. So I told them about it. The light in my parents' eyes was enough to fill me with happiness again. My mom gave her little high-pitched voice and said how happy she was, and my dad said that he was proud of me and again offered to help me with my tuition. I was incredibly thankful for them and felt loved, but the happy feeling wouldn't last. Danny scoffed at me and said, "Okay, it's just a pre-assessment. You still have to be approved to get in." To which I corrected him, saying that I was approved. I was just under 18, so I didn't have an acceptance letter yet. They even explained that to me. He then laughed and said that that's not how the real world worked, and called me naive. I know it probably wasn't the right thing to do, but I was getting pretty upset. Everyone talked about him and congratulated him, but when it came to me, I was never good enough for him, and I never understood why. I told him, "Do you want me to get the letter to prove it?" And he responded by saying that he didn't need some kid trying to prove him wrong. My parents were trying to get us to stop, but I was already pretty annoyed, and I felt the need to stand up for myself and my parents. "What is your problem with me, Danny?" I said angrily as I sat in my seat. "My problem? You are the problem. I don't even know why you're here. You're not even part of this family. They just brought you in out of pity because your drugged-up mother left you to die." I remember the words like it had just happened, because it still hurts. I knew I was adopted, My parents never tried to hide it from me, but they never made me feel like I was second best or unloved. I knew they loved me. But now I finally knew for certain. It was finally clear what I had always feared. Danny never loved me, let alone even liked me. And I tried hard for his approval. My dad yelled at him for what he said to me, but I just told them that I was okay and that I would like to be excused. I got up and started towards my room, even as my mom pleaded for me to stay. As I put my plate in the sink and started walking away, Danny continued to mock me, saying more hurtful things, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I know this last part was my fault, but I'd been pushed to my limit. You know, Danny, maybe they adopted me because they wanted a second chance at a successful son. That was the first time that I had ever heard my mom say my name in a negative tone. I knew I was in trouble, but I really didn't care. But as I walked down the hall, I heard the sound of a chair scrape across the floor and heavy footsteps coming towards me. Then I heard my parents shouting for Danny. I barely turned around when I was met with his fist to my face. I collapsed to the floor and he proceeded to punch me a few more times in the face, and that was probably the worst pain that I'd ever experienced. I remember crying, or maybe trying to, and I heard my parents yelling at him before I finally blacked out. I woke up shortly after as my mom was trying to clean my face up. I was a mess. They took me to the hospital because I definitely needed stitches in my scalp, and unfortunately, because I was still a minor, they had to file a report. My brother was arrested, but none of us pressed charges, even when I was asked. I chose not to. My father really considered it too, but I think deep down he didn't want to either. I had a long talk with my parents who told me that I shouldn't have said what I said, and I agreed, and apologized to them because I knew it wasn't true. They weren't disappointed at him, but for some reason, he seemed to think that. And I knew that they loved me and were proud of me too, but I just couldn't take his hateful comments anymore. This was 2 years ago, and I've only seen my brother briefly twice since. Once when my mom had knee surgery, and once when he stopped by their place to pick up some of his mail while I was visiting. I still go home to visit them for holiday breaks, but he never comes. They go out and have dinner with him instead. I even apologized to him for what I said, and all he said in return was, "Okay." So, not even an apology from him. I don't even know if he is sorry. Anyways, this was my crazy family story. Even though it wasn't too scary, it was scary enough for me knowing what my brother did to me, as a minor while he was a full-fledged adult. I still hope that one day we may have a normal brotherly relationship, but until then, I guess I'll just pretend that I was an only child. Every time around this time of year, there is an event that comes back to the front of my mind. There are a few people from the family that are reminded of it by others, while some of us crack jokes about it now. Sure, it definitely wasn't funny at the time, but now, it's a way for some of us to get past it. Humor can be healing, right? As a child, I remembered our family always having a pretty extensive Thanksgiving. My grandparents had a nice-sized house, and they would always host it. My parents, my 2 siblings, and I would always be there, as well as plenty of aunts and uncles and cousins. I had a lot of cousins close to my age, so I always had plenty of kids around to play with too. I was probably 10 at the time of this event. In fact, I had just turned 10 the month prior, in October. There was also one uncle specifically that I loved being around, Uncle Rob. He was very friendly and was the type to listen to you no matter your age, and was always engaged in the conversation. saying he was proud of you, excited for you, things like that. I knew the grandparents of the house we were at were my mom's parents because she always called them Mom and Pops. But I remember asking if Uncle Rob was Mom's brother or Dad's brother. At the time, I was curious because they both called him by his name, but still hugged him and treated him as a brother. But at the time, my older brother and younger sister both called me Bubba, so being a kid, I was confused why they didn't call him that. Their answer was kind of ambiguous at first. They said he wasn't really the brother to either of them, but that he was like a brother, and explained in a way how he was kind of adopted into the family. They also asked me not to mention it to anyone as it could hurt someone's feelings. I agreed and never really thought anything more of it. I never thought of him any differently, and he also had a son, my cousin Dylan, and he was one of my favorite cousins. He's about 2 or 3 years older than I was, and was still interested in the same things, such as the Pokemon card game. So I looked at him as someone cool and often hung out with him when we were together. So on this Thanksgiving, we all started arriving. We were one of the first ones there, and my mom helped with a lot of the cooking. Shortly after everyone else got there, all of us kids were playing in the back living room, while most of the adults were sprinkled around the kitchen and living rooms. As usual, it was a great time. All of us kids talked, made up games, and played with some of the toys and setups our grandparents kept around for us, and we would randomly hear the adults talking and laughing too. Amidst the chatter of the house, it seemed to get quieter on the adult side of things. I didn't hear a lot of people shouting or laughing, and I got curious. I told my cousins that I would be back and walked towards the kitchen to get a drink, which was an easy enough ruse to give myself a reason to check on what was going on. While standing in the kitchen, I could hear the music that my grandma had turned on earlier, something we couldn't hear because of how loud the house had gotten. But even more curious was the conversation that I was hearing, and a raspy, slurred voice that I couldn't place. The conversation definitely was not a happy one, and I once again wanted to see what was going on. I approached the doorway to the living room where my Uncle Rob was blocking it. I managed to duck under him a bit, and I saw a woman standing by the front door. She had on a very short dress and sneakers, with a thick, fluffy coat hanging off her shoulders. But there was a very weird feeling in the air. It was like anger and fear. It was a very similar feeling to when I did something bad, and my parents yelled at me, middle name and all. But it wasn't towards me. I could tell that it was for this strange woman. Now, this may not be exactly the conversation since it has been several years since this event, but between what I remember and what my parents have told me, this is what I heard. My grandpa was the first person that I heard talking to the woman at the door, and he sounded very angry. It was not a tone that I was used to hearing from him. He told her that she wasn't supposed to be there, which seemed to make the woman angry. Why not? Why can't I see my family? I want to see my son. My grandpa responded angrily, but keeping his voice low. You've been given chances time and time again, Margaret. We can't keep doing this. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to Dylan. I just want to have Thanksgiving with my family. Why is he allowed to be here but not me? I'm your daughter, Arthur, she yelled as she pointed at my Uncle Rob. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't know who this woman was, but she was claiming to be my grandpa's daughter. I knew all of my mom's siblings. Even if we weren't close, I could still name them all off. And she was not on that list. Why did she seem so angry at my Uncle Rob? My grandpa started yelling at her that she was not allowed there anymore until she was clean, and told her that she needed to leave before he called the cops. My mom then approached the woman, but I could see the sadness in her eyes as she shuffled her out the front door. After she left and my mom came back in, the atmosphere still felt tense, until my grandma said something to lighten the mood. Thankfully, it didn't take long before everyone loosened up, and we were all back to having fun again. When my mom realized I was there, she pulled me to the side and made me promise to not mention the situation that I witnessed to Uncle Rob, and especially not to Dylan. To which I agreed. Once the celebration was back into full swing, we started smelling something funny. At this point in the night, I had gone to the front living room and was watching TV with my grandmother, and she hollered for someone to check the stove because she could smell something burning. I started to smell it too, but I remember it being something specific that I couldn't quite pinpoint. One of my uncles came into the living room and confirmed the stove was not on, but then his face twisted and confirmed what we were smelling. It was wood. Almost like what we would smell when we had a bonfire, but it also had a chemical smell to it, what I now recognize as the smell of treated wood burning. Many of the adults started looking concerned, and were looking around the house frantically, doing a head count on all the kids. Then my dad came back in from the front door, and was telling us all to get out. As the adults grabbed all of us kids, we all ran out, and that's when I saw the smoke. The sun was setting, but I could still see the dark smoke billowing into the sky. The fire trucks showed up quickly and put out the fire before significant damage was done. The fire had started by the garage and spread to the spare bedroom behind it that was just being used as storage. The rest of that night was a blur, as I felt like I slept in spurts. We all were there pretty late. My parents were talking to a lot of cops and walking around the house. After some time, my dad took us kids home and my mom stayed there. Over the next few days, things calmed down and life seemed to continue as normal, other than a few extra trips to my grandparents because my dad helped fix up their house. I kept my promise, and even though I was very curious about that incident, I never asked or mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't until years later that I was finally let in on the details of that day and how we got there. The mystery lady, Margaret, is actually my aunt, my mom's youngest sister, and my Uncle Rob was her ex-husband, making Dylan her son. My Aunt Margaret had an issue with drugs, and she met my Uncle Rob when she was trying to get clean. He was apparently a huge asset in keeping her sober, and they ended up getting married and having Dylan. However, shortly after Dylan was born, she seemed to relapse, and she was putting the three of them in dangerous situations. So, with my grandparents' support, Uncle Rob told her that she needed to get clean again or that they would get a divorce and that he would take Dylan. She responded to this by trying to stab my Uncle Rob while Dylan slept in his room nearby. Obviously, she was unsuccessful and went away for some time, but apparently, that time did not sober her up. Uncle Rob didn't have much in the way of his own biological family, so he was accepted into our family with open arms. And that's why my mom always just explained that he was adopted by us. So when my Aunt Margaret showed up at that Thanksgiving, obviously under the influence of something, she was told to leave. And, once again, she took revenge by setting the house on fire. They easily found evidence supporting this, and she went away for several more years. As far as I know, from those in my family that I do keep in contact with, no one has heard from her in years. My mom says that she still feels bad for her, but she's also aware and understands that she keeps putting herself in these situations. It was really scary at the time, thinking that my aunt, this woman that I'd never met, was willing to set her parents' house on fire, while it was filled with her family, and even her son, just out of anger. And while I really don't care to meet her at this point in my life, I do hope that she's at least okay and possibly gotten better. And hopefully has never tried to do something so violent to another person again. So this was a collection of some scary family gathering stories. The third of this collection I've done since I've started this channel. I try to get these stories together and ready for the Thanksgiving season, as the beginning of November to the end of November seems to be when family gatherings take place. I meant end of December, but I said November, and I'm not going to stop this to correct myself because that's not how we do things around here. Anyways, it's family gathering season, at least on this side of the world. I don't know about many other countries. I know that Canadian Thanksgiving is... Oh, my Canadian friends are going to be very mad at me. End of October, beginning of November? I don't remember exactly, but, you know, I'm also not Canadian. And as some of you have pointed out, I'm very much not Australian. I'm sorry that I can't say Maka's right. Okay? I'm sure I just said it wrong there. Anyways, scary family gathering stories. Stories about family gatherings that have terrible situations. Terrifying situations. These ones were all incredibly sad as well as scary. Yeah. Fantastic stories, though. And thank you to those who submitted the stories or those who let me use their stories online. I do appreciate it. You guys help continue this channel's growth. You know who else helps continue this channel's growth? You! That's right. You. Literally you. Person that's listening. I was going to go on this spiel, and it was going to be stupid, but I decided not to. Anyways, I have not stopped the recording, though. I've continued going. It's because of people like you that listen that help this channel continue to grow. So if you've listened for a while and you're still new, or not necessarily new, but if you've been listening and haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. Those subscription numbers, those subscriber numbers, mean a lot to YouTube channels. I don't know if you know that. Because YouTube kind of grades you on your subscriptions. The more subscribers you have, the harder they tend to push you. So, just consider subscribing if you haven't yet. If you enjoyed these stories, please consider hitting that thumbs up button, as YouTube uses interactions such as subscriptions and comments, not subscriptions, likes and comments, to push videos harder, not just channels. So that helps a lot for the algorithm. You can also comment down below, letting me know your thoughts. How are you doing? Are you prepared for the winter season? Do you have any plans this upcoming next week if you are in a country, the US, that celebrates Thanksgiving this upcoming Thursday? I do. Yeah. You can also join memberships or Patreon to get early access to content like this if you so feel tempted to do so. Never expected, always appreciated. And that's about it. I've been listening to a lot of Frank Sinatra lately. Come to find out that I actually do quite like Frank Sinatra. And I have a YouTube music station for Sinatra that also plays Nat King Cole, who I also enjoy, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and a few others. Anyways, I just wanted to say that. I've been enjoying some Sinatra lately. I really like the song My Way. The 2008 remastered version of it on the... I believe it was a greatest hits album. I don't know. It's a good song. It's interesting. And honestly, listening to it is calming whenever you're trying to do stuff that's technical. So, just wanted to say that. That's all. Anyways, friends, hope you all have a beautiful day. Hope I do see you again here next time. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Do not forget it. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. And until I see you again, my beautiful friends, much love and sleep well.